Welcome to the Case for Funding the Arts and Resetting the Creative Economy. I'm Erica Mallon, Executive Director of the Aspen Institute Arts Program. Many advocacy groups are making the case for big and new solutions to support the recovery and long-term sustainability of this critical industry that, like many, have been devastated by COVID-19. We've put together a panel of practitioners from different perspectives who are major industry leaders, innovators, and advocates to further this discussion, including the most recent news that movie theaters and other venues may be opening shortly. I'm pleased to welcome first Jason Farago. He is the art critic at large for the New York Times and a regular contributor to The Guardian, The New Yorker, and Art Forum. He recently authored the New York Times feature, Can the Arts Bring Us Back?, on how federal government support is critical to recovery. Nutaki Garrett is an acclaimed director who has worked in theaters across the country and was named artistic director of the renowned Oregon Shakespeare Festival in 2019. He is currently mobilizing theater organizations across the nation on the industry's recovery. Jeremy O'Harris is playwright, screenwriter, and producer for film and television. His open letter to President Biden and Vice President Harris helped spur the campaign Be an Arts Hero, a grassroots effort calling on the Senate to allocate long-term relief to the arts and culture sector. And Kate Levin leads Bloomberg's Cultural Assets Management team and oversees Bloomberg Philanthropy's arts program, which is also providing major COVID relief funding. Previously, Kate was commissioner of the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. And our moderator, of course, is Anna Deavere Smith, incredible actress, groundbreaking playwright, author, and professor at New York University's Tisch School of the Arts and Aspen Institute trustee. Before I turn it over to Anna, I want to give some context to launch the conversation. According to the Federal Bureau of Economic Analysis, the arts and cultural economy is bigger than transportation or agriculture. It contributes $878 billion to our national economy and employs over 5 million people. Arts and culture also contribute at least $1 billion in revenue in each of the 50 states and is one of our biggest and most influential exports. Beyond the numbers, the fact that the arts has the unique power to educate, inspire, and foster empathy that is essential to society and our democracy that can lead us to meaningful social change. So with that context and more to come, I give my thanks to all the participants, and I will now turn it over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Erica, very much, and thank you, Kitty Boone and the Aspen Institute. Thank you, Kitty, for putting us on the agenda. I expected nothing less of you. Jason, we have a half an hour, and all of you are quite verbal on this panel, and so we have a half an hour, and let's just jump right in. And of course, Jason, your article, Can the Arts Bring Us Back?, was so important. Let's start with some of the ideas you put forth there and what you're thinking since you wrote the article, given the fact that I'm sure you got a lot of response to it.
I did. Thanks very much for this, and thanks to all of you for watching. The question of arts funding, I think it's important to break down into short-term and long-term. And the article that I wrote was very specifically about short-term questions for the economics of culture. As we were just hearing, beyond culture's value in and of itself, culture is an industry sector of no small size, 4.5% of GDP. And here in New York, in the state of New York, that is, I believe it's something like 7 or 8% of GDP. Though I am, of course, always wary of reducing the value of culture to anything on a bottom line, we are talking about massive, massive numbers. And in unemployment terms, massive numbers as well. More than half of actors and dancers were out of work in 2020 when the unemployment rate in general was around 8 or 9%. So we are talking not just large deficits, but very precipitous falls, and ones that therefore require quite precipitous reactions. What I wanted to really insist upon was the economic as opposed to the cultural approach that the new Biden administration might possibly take. First, by really insisting on unemployment insurance and other forms of unemployment relief possibly including new approaches to the tax code that could very possibly make lives better for artists immediately in the short term. And when I say artists, I don't even just mean visual artists, actors, dancers. I also mean technicians, stage managers, all the people in the cultural sector that keep our culture vibrant and alive. Beyond that is the question of whether there is a role for direct federal employment for artists and other cultural practitioners on the model of the WPA in the 1930s or CETA in the 1970s, whether there is an important role that the federal government can play in quite direct spending. I believe there is, though, again, it would be something that would be less culturally targeted and more understood as emergency funding, as an emergency activity. And I'd love to talk to our other panelists about that, too. And then finally, I was interested in the question of whether a Department of Culture or a White House Office of Culture could possibly organize or synchronize the government's response to the possible cultural depression that we're facing. I think that people can have legitimate differences about the right way for the federal government to engage with culture, but something larger and something more direct is clearly necessary.
So, Jeremy, of course, your very exhaustive and wonderful letter to Biden and Harris, and you've been on the front lines with Be an Arts Hero and lots of other ways that you've been incredibly generous to the arts community. Take it away from what Jason has said, and let's hear some of your ideas.
Yeah, I mean, and again, thank you all for having me. I still feel very odd being in sort of like the company of idols and wildly intelligent, like people who do a lot of different things. But for me, it all came from the sense that what's happening to my peers and many other people is incredibly dire. And people aren't thinking about the fact that, you know, the loss of a season or 2 seasons of theater is the like beginning and end of an artistic career for many people at the very beginning of it, and a lot of people in the nascence of their career. Because this year and a half of no work, no money, and no options is going to be it's been a year where people have had to figure out, like, do they stay in these cultural centers in New York or LA or Chicago? Can they afford to pay their food expenses and their light expenses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And so for me, thinking about moments when America was in a major economic crisis and how they got out of it, I started to think a lot about the New Deal and the WPA and Federal One, and how Federal One in its creation was created not just to get people working in art sectors in America, but to get people all around America working from arts. Like the goal of the Federal Theater Project was to make sure that there was theater happening in all 50 states, which is like a wildly inclusive and like incredibly necessary act, because what FDR and a lot of his cohorts saw was that art wasn't just something for the soul, which I think is sort of the thing that a lot of artists lean on when they try to advocate to the public. And the soul is intangible; no one cares about it. But what art also is our greatest export. It's our one of our best tools of like explaining to the world like America's freedom, right? And I'm not here like banging the drum of imperialism as like a good thing, but I'm speaking the language of politics and saying, if you want to be able to keep shaping the culture in the way we have, and you want there to be a generation that can do that later, then like the people that can do that need to be fed and need to be paid to build this work and have some financial foundations for how they're going to continue making this work for the next 5 to 10 years. Because the arts, the people who run arts organizations are freaking out right now because they don't have any money from their from the federal government, and they also are losing the money from the philanthropists who have funded most of the arts organizations in America for the last 60, 70 years. And I think Nataki could probably speak more to that, but I feel like it must be a really hard time to be a nonprofit in this moment because pockets are tighter everywhere. And so I think this is like becoming an even more pressing issue for the new Biden administration to start thinking about the ways to like bail out, if you will, arts workers across America.
Great. And Nataki, on 2 counts, yes, also 50 states, you're way out there in Oregon. So for you, this is not, a New York City thing at all. And you are as Jeremy has suggested, running an arts organization. Are you freaking out? Can't hear you. Can't hear you talking. Are you? You're muted.
Is that better?
That's much better. I was asking if you're freaking out.
I was freaking out. I don't know if I'm freaking out as much as I was at the height of this last year. This time last year we opened 5 shows, we closed them in 6 days, we laid off 500 people. And then we got about the business, as we started talking to our 1% donors right away. They were involved in all kinds of activities, including this was an election year. So just like Jeremy said, there was a waning of resources. Not that they didn't give, they just didn't give in the way that we needed them to in order to pull us through this time. And so I worked with a group of arts organizations here in Oregon, and we were able to procure $8 million of the CARES Act fund. The reason why I'm saying that is because that led me to push towards building a coalition. And so I'm working with about 40 theaters from across the United States and the law firm Arnold and Porter, and we represent every region of the country, urban and rural, large and small, predominantly white theaters and culturally specific theaters. We sort of run as much of the gamut as we possibly can. And we actually lobbied to make sure that the nonprofit theaters were included in the recent Save Our Stages bill, which became the SBOG. And so we hope that at the end of all of the comb out that they're doing legislatively, that we will still have access to that tranche of money. But my thing was the only way we can get the arts workers working is if the theaters remain. And so, I'm at the beginning of my leadership here at OSF. It was important for me to make sure that we could pull through to the other side. It's interesting because we actually asked during the entire lobbying period, trying to make sure that the nonprofit theaters were included in SVOG, if we could be a resource, if we could actually procure some money to be able to give emergency funding to some of our artists. I have a company theater. So we have actors and we have technicians and we have artisans and we have crews, and we're working with all the unions, and everybody is out of work. Like I said, 500 people. We asked, and we were told there's no way that the federal government was going to float the money through us unless we could hire people back. So we're just waiting for the go ahead to see when we can start to hire people back, and as soon as we can, we will. In the meantime, we started to put money into people's pockets in as many other ways as we possibly can, because like Jeremy said, and like Jason said, we're about to lose a generation in these 2 years of this pandemic seems like it's going to last all the way through this year. We're going to lose a generation of artists who would launch their careers into these first couple of years, begin their early days in this work and be able to establish themselves so that in 5 years, they're more established and better capable of taking advantage of opportunities. So we have to build the whole industry back. Holding on, having this little tranche of money is great for artistic organizations, but it's only going to last us for a little bit. We actually have to get the whole thing back rolling again.
Kate, you are a philanthropist. You work in government as the New York City Cultural Affairs Commissioner. And I also know that you have some sense of history. Do you feel it's too optimistic to think that we might be able to build something like a federal theater? And why are we in the position of nonprofit and for-profit anyway? In other words, many of the assumptions we make are things that didn't already exist. So what do you think, just looking at history, about what we might do, what we're not thinking about?
I think the history here is really germane. It doesn't for a minute set aside the urgency people are feeling, this sense that Nataki and Jeremy and Jason have conveyed about what's really at stake. But let me start by saying, and I've been advocating for this field for a long time. My hair wasn't gray when I started, and coming out of 2008, a congressman read into the congressional record that arts were not going to be included except for aquariums and golf courses because this wasn't real work. So, credit to all of you for, in a relatively short period of time, really starting to change the advocacy game. and make this whole sector get taken seriously at the federal government level. Government isn't the only indicator of the importance of the sector, but it's certainly an important bellwether. And I think the historical context here, really in the US, the division of nonprofit, the creation of the nonprofit sector, there were some pre-World War II, but it really took off after that. And and the real explosion in the theater industry, for example, was with the Ford Foundation in 1961, seeding the regional theater company movement. But there were something like 23 regional theaters in 1960. Now there are, or were, over 2,000. It's an extraordinary rate of growth. The same thing with museums. I think half of the museums in the US were created since 1970. There's some statistic I read that a new museum was being created once every 3 days in the early 1960s. So, the great news in all that is that the sector has risen to meet the need. The awful, unpleasant news is that we tend to think that yesterday is the way things always were. Not so much the case here. And so, the conversation on the spectrum of the creative sector, from amateur to professional and from nonprofit to commercial, in some ways this is a real reckoning. And the question is, how do you come out the other side with the most vibrant group of artists and the ability to meet audiences? And the position of organizations is really, how do you mediate that relationship? I think a lot of the attention gets focused on organizations, as it should, but almost as a self-perpetuating kind of momentum. And sometimes, in the past at least, the question of supporting artists has gotten dropped out. That was certainly the case of the culture wars in the 1990s. So bringing that back and bringing this all back as a sector where real people do real work is so urgent.
Right. Well, yeah, but you and I both know that foundations are not very excited about supporting individual artists. And speaking of organizations, I can't possibly sit here in good conscience and hear words like soul and hear words like empathy and not think about the fact that after the murder of George Floyd was a time that many artists and arts organizations had to think about just how healthy our organizations are and are not. And are we really the ones who can walk around talking about helping America's soul and being empathic? Nataki, could you respond?
Yeah, so Oregon Shakespeare Festival has been focused on the work of equity, diversity, and inclusion before I got here in 2019. So it's been invested in this work for like 8 or 9 years, and it led the charge across the field. That said, when I looked at the We See You White American Theater demands list that came out last summer, I couldn't help but wonder how many of those demands came out of experiences people had within our kinds of theaters. People like to say that when I talk to some of my colleagues in the field, that the George Floyd murder and the protest that ensued and the uprising that ensued with Black Lives Matter right after, that's for them a kind of turning point. For me, I feel like turning point happened, when I the first time I entered a white theater space and realized that I was the other. And so for me, it's a mandate to make sure that when we do bring our theaters back, that we bring them back with this idea of not just being equitable, and it's not only about being anti-racist, it's about creating spaces where the artists are not harmed. And there have been several articles that that our writers have written and that our actors have said, and there were a bunch of exposés on Facebook last year where people said that they had these terrible experiences, and we cannot create a space in which that can happen. And we can bring back our theaters, yes, sure, but we also have to bring them back into relevancy, and that requires that we do this real work. And so OSF, for example, after all of those years of doing this work in equity and diversity and inclusion, we've decided to take on the demands list from the We See White American Theater as a document to help lead us to what is the 21st century version of how do we shift this. Because those demands were created by artists like Jeremy, like myself, like you, Anna Deavere Smith. Those are the demands that represent real experiences that we've had in the theater, and we have to shift. And if you're not shifting your theater, it won't be relevant for the rest of the 21st century. So the industries have to shift. The arts have to shift. We have participated in white supremacy in some of the most egregious ways, including the way we bring people into our spaces. By saying that these are the most important pieces of art. These playwrights, we center men, we center cisgendered white men, we center cisgendered Black and brown men, and we do not take on the stories that allow for people to live in their full dynamic expression. And then we ask those people to come into the room, and we go, well, how come you don't want to come back? Because nothing in this room has invited me. So we have to shift across the board. And actually, the theater actually has an opportunity to lead this idea of becoming a more just and equitable anti-racist society in which the artists are not harmed. But we actually have to step into the gap in order to do that.
What are some of the other things as we're in this emergency moment, and triage? Emergencies do bring new ways of doing things. What are some of the other things we need to think about when we so-called come back? And I'm, also just thinking about what Kate, was pointing out. It's like all of a sudden, there's 2,000 arts institutions and more compared to 200 or whatever. So we can't possibly say America doesn't like art, right? We like to say that stuff when we are of value to this country. I see you shaking your head, Jeremy.
Yeah, no.
Things we need to fix. Other things we need to fix coming back.
There are a litany of things, and I just want to say I didn't sign the We See You American Theater letter because I felt like it was so invested in institutions that are already fraught and already broken, right? It's like master's house, master's tools, yada, yada, yada. So I was just like, I have no interest in this. I think we need to invest in literally creating entirely new spaces. And I pulled this book out because it's really important to me. It's called Radical Black Theater and the New Deal. And one of the things that really touched me that Kate just said was that it was the question of how do we have the most vibrant group of artists supported when we come back. And I don't think that'll happen if we give the money to institutions, because the most vibrant groups of artists generally aren't represented by those theaters. I don't know that we can trust theaters that have just now discovered that racism existed in 2000, at the end of 2020, to find Black and brown people to put at the center of these things. I don't know if I want to trust theaters that just remembered that women are under the foot of patriarchy during the Me Too movement in 2017 to be in charge of this leadership. And one of the things that people don't remember about the Federal Run and the Federal Writers Project and the Federal Theater Project is that because it was so democratized and socialized and anyone could get the money, you had people doing radical work, making the first culturally specific theater companies, the first gender specific theater companies, because they were able to get this money from the government and do whatever the hell they wanted to do with it. There was no artistic director to tell them how to work on it. No board that said we will or won't produce this. They got to do radical work in the ways they wanted to do it, and it actually jump-started the sense that identitarian work and affinity theater companies were possible and were necessary to making these radical things. I think also, too, that in this moment, one of the things that's been so frustrating about watching how institutions have responded to it, outside of their silence, is their inability to imagine that this moment could be a moment for radical transformation of our industry. This, for the first time ever, we were all forced to be in a space that many of our theater friends who are theater lovers and partners and comrades who are theater makers have had to deal with. Because I know many disabled and immunocompromised theater artists who can't just casually go to a theater on a Tuesday night for whatever reason. And this, for me, felt like a moment to invest in new processes and new practices of radically inviting new audiences to spaces that they have never been felt invited to before. And I felt like I saw a lot of people dropping the ball in that way. So I decided to take a lot of the money I had gotten from my HBO deal to start investing in the work of theater artists who I thought were thinking outside of the box of like the four walls of a theater that was created by some white man in the 1960s, and saying like, hey, how can I get this to a bunch of queer Black and brown kids all over the country, all over the world, over a week online? And I think we did that. We made this show called Circle Jerk that went like incredibly viral. I've been supporting this young trans theater maker named Sis and her exploration of what it means to be a Black trans woman through this digital theater show she did that premiered on YouTube. And I financed Will Aubrey's Heroes of the Fourth Turning right before the election. And each of those shows have had over 50,000 people watch them. And they were all presented for essentially free or on sliding scales and have made back over $300,000. And these are 3 independent theater adventures that just like were me exploring with my own money and the ingenuity of young artists. And the fact that the public theater, MTC, CTG were not the people at the front line of doing this work is shocking to me.
Well, they're not going to be at the front line of doing the work, Jeremy, for the very reason that you just said. And Kate indicates this too. It's individuals who are nimble and opportunistic. Kate, those are words I've heard you use, and I'm stealing them. I love those words. Who can do something. Institutions cannot move that quickly. You're a philanthropist, but you're also generous of heart and not only thinking about your own career. You know that your own career can only really thrive in a healthier environment. Jason, back to the economy. What do you think is really realistic for us to focus on?
What's realistic? I think that in the spring and the early summer of 2020, it was not even remotely realistic to imagine that Mitch McConnell's Senate would authorize the largest government stimulus package that, at least in absolute terms, not relative terms, that this country's ever seen. And the idea that $600 a week of supplemental unemployment insurance was dispersed under the previous government was not something I necessarily thought was ever possible. And in particular, what I think was extremely important, and I think what needs to be really reinforced right now, is that $600 a week of supplemental unemployment insurance was not just for people who got W-2 money, it was for people who got 1099 money, people who were self-employed or otherwise in the gig economy, which includes most of our artists, our musicians, and other people working in the cultural sector. It's called Pandemic Unemployment Insurance, and it's one of the most extraordinary achievements of the CARES Act. I think that what Janet Yellen and also Marty Walsh at Labor should really be thinking about is how we can possibly alleviate the tax burden and the disadvantages that come with being self-employed or that come with being a gig worker that artists take on, especially early in their career, in order to develop their career in such a way that they can actually make enough money in order to put food on the table. What kind of programs, at least in economic terms, as opposed to in cultural terms, can we really imagine? One I think that is extremely important is the idea of recognizing that people who work in the arts are workers and not just artists, and need to be insured as such, taxed as such, and given retirement benefits, maternity leave, all sorts of things like this. There are models in Europe and Australia that can be profitably looked at here. And then one final thing I would really want to say, Kate was mentioning earlier, the example of the culture wars of the 1980s and early 1990s, I think it's pretty clear that the idea of individual funding for artists at the kind of NEA level is not coming back anytime soon because of essentially because of the sort of high risk and low reward in which, like, for a very small amount of funding, you risk massive governmental scandal. What is possible, and I think it's something that Jeremy was raising earlier, is what made the programs of the 1930s so successful? It was precisely because there were no strings attached economic stimulus packages, as opposed to a more European-style cultural funding that gave the vibrancy and the diversity of programming. And it's worth pointing out, I said this in the piece I wrote for the Times, a lot of things that were done under Federal Project Number 1 were not masterpieces. But that was not the goal. It was a work product. And if some of them were enduring, and if others of them have been forgotten, that is not actually the principal means by which we should assess the importance of these programs. It is about giving artists, and in particular, I would know, Black artists in the 1930s, there had never been, and until the end of the 20th century, any level of federal funding for Black artists, and also writers, I should point out, that even comes close to approximating what Federal Project Number 1 did. But what was so important is that they said to them, you know what? You can't have a woman with her bare breasts out, and you can't have a hammer and sickle on it. But other than that, take the money. And that really, really is, I think, what has to be understood. And it's especially why I think that thinking in short term, thinking as stimulus as opposed to as cultural packages, is precisely the way the Biden administration should be done.
So I'm going to take questions from the our watchers very quickly. But Kate, I just want to know, do you agree with what Jason said in terms of the culture wars and what happened to individual artists then? Do you agree that we're not going to see individual artists anytime soon?
I think you don't only have to depend on the federal government for this kind of support. I do find it interesting that jazz musicians and poets still do get individual awards from the NEA, and one could kind of draw the inference that they are not perhaps as influential as the NEA4 might be.
Well, they will talk.
Exactly, and those are sort of safer, more charming practices. One doesn't expect sort of radical innovation. I don't know that that's true, but again, one could infer that sticking with those kind of individual awards. But there's the consortium USA Artists has been giving individual no-strings grants to mid-career artists for over 10 years now. And that was a consortium of philanthropies that came together after doing some really interesting work that showed that 98% of Americans value the arts, but only 26% value artists. So I think part of what we need to deal with is that there has been a really damaging shift since the New Deal in the perception of the arts, and in particular the nonprofit arts. And I think we have given way too much value to the marketplace as a medium for determining what's generally acceptable. And Anna, you and I have talked about there's a way in which value has become confused with aesthetics. You can watch what happened to the market 2 weeks ago with the GameStop run up. Like, the market is not perfect and pure. It doesn't function the way a lot of economists want to think it does. You can really put your thumb on that scale. But getting back to arts and culture, I do think there has to be this continued advocacy around reestablishing the value, separate from market, of artists, again, as workers. And what I would say, to Jason's point, what I find really hopeful is the start of recognition that, on a technical basis, we need something called portable benefits. If you're a gig worker, you should be able to take your benefits from one job to the next. And how how your taxation is rolled up should not be determined based on a model of work from the 1950s, that you had one job and you stayed there forever. In some ways, artists are at the vanguard of a whole new description of the work world, and owning that, seizing that, pushing it forward as a point of economic advocacy, I think is both essential to the field, but could do so much good for so many, and that absolutely needs to be pursued.
So, can I just add one last point before, because I know you want to open it up to questions, but it's just so important. What Kate mentioned earlier about GameStop reminds me. We were talking about historical examples here, and for people like me and Jeremy, who were, for whom 2008 is the sort of defining moment of our sort of early careers. I think that when the pandemic began and when the markets tanked in March, we sort of thought it's 2008 all over again. And I think that what's really important to point out is that it's not. We are not living through a financial crisis. We were living through a very, very deep recession that almost turned into a depression. But on the financial side of the equation, the markets are just fine. or I mean, they swooned around March, but by June, July, they were back in pretty fine fettle. And if, as many of the indications suggest, we're going to have a pretty robust economy in 2021, and yet we are still looking at massive, massive problems for the creative artists, then I think we have some really important questions to ask ourselves, particularly about philanthropy in this country and what it means when philanthropic giving has declined, not precipitously, but it has gone down at a moment of massive financial boom, as opposed to the 2008-2009 example, where at least there really were hits to people's bottom lines.
Mm.
Okay. Well, we could go further on that, but I'm going to do my job here and take some questions from the audience. Many artists are this is Morgan Walsh. Many artists are using online efforts, collaboration, teaching, promoting creatively during this challenge. Do you see this as a new part of the art's future? So I read this question as being about technology, really, and how that puts us in a different moment than some of the moments we've been talking about before, and I open it to whoever wants to address it.
I mean, I think that, like, to ignore the fact that for many people, a digital life is like the closest thing to a part-time job they can have, is like, is ignorant. Like, one of the things that was really exciting to me was to discover that, like, my abilities in, like, sort of like building up or using influence online, created me like a new source of income, but also gave me an audience that was like much bigger than this very small insular audience of the theater. And I think that that's been a model for a lot of other young playwrights, like filmmakers, etc., in my circle and in broader circles outside of that. And I think that, one of the things that's necessary to also remember is that, like, the only dramaturgy that many millennials and Generation Z, like, artists know is that of, like, social media. Like, that is the clearest storytelling mode that they understand. So it makes sense that they would start figuring out new ways to integrate those technologies into the work that they were doing. In the same way that, like, when, modernism happened, or, like, sort of psychological realism started to happen on our stage, it was because this new tech, this new idea around psychology was becoming a part of, like, everyone's everyday. So then it became more necessary to not do, like, a melodrama where people had big emotions, but to do something more insular, which is how I see it.
Freud and Stanislavski, same generation. Anybody else want to tap on technology at all?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes, of course, and I think that there are some aspects of the theater world that have already been doing that. Have been embarking on performance art or happenings, or if you happen to go to one of those training programs that allowed you to be more adventurous, you were already doing that, and you were excited about that program because it was going to give you the tools and the resources to be able to follow that, as opposed to the sort of standardized training towards the American theater system. But the other thing is that I was really excited at the top of the pandemic when, at this moment of real angst around whether or not we were going to survive as an industry, I'm watching my theater friends just make art, just go online and make it, just send me a link to the thing that they're making, send me a play that they wanted me to read to see if we had the access to do it. And actually, you're right, Anna, that when you have 500 people on board, when you take those 500 people away from an organization, you are not nimble. So OSF is not a nimble place. We're trying to make it so that we can respond in nimble ways where we can, but we don't want to get in the way. The response of the artist is actually at the center of what we do. And creating spaces in which the artist can respond to their impulses is exactly what theater should be here for, not just for making sure you have the right marketing department and you have the right systems in place. You actually have to create a space in which the artist can respond, where you don't stifle that. And I actually do feel like since sometime in the 70s, there was this kind of gradual stifling of that impulse in the artist. So I celebrate what you're doing, Jeremy. I celebrate what you said, this idea that the artist is gonna, like, step up and respond and do something that we could never imagine in our spaces, not because of our audiences, but because we just don't have the machine that does that, right? I as a leader of one of the largest arts organizations in the United States, nonprofit arts organizations, I miss the nimbleness. I miss the ability to just let's go and respond. But literally, when I plan a reading, 35 people have to come back to work. So we're just not that nimble. And that's why the artists have to be nimble, because we're going to be following you all. We're going to be following you into the future. Without you, there is no future.
So, Kate, what about that? What can philanthropy do if Nataki is correct in her assessment? Is there a role for philanthropy? And why don't they trust individual artists?
Our philanthropy certainly does. I think there has been a vein in recent philanthropy, venture philanthropy, the notion that you want an output, and that investing in art is an investment, and you need an ROI. And I do think one of the great preciousness things about the arts, in the good sense of precious, is that it's so unpredictable. But the underlying benefits are so clear time and again. It's about consensus building. It's about collectivity. It's about the challenge of actually getting an audience to pay attention. And I think that is something that deeply interests a lot of philanthropists that I talk to. There has been a waning in U.S. philanthropy of arts funding. A lot of major foundations have moved away from it. I'd like to think that they're going to start to move back because of this sort of momentum towards a different understanding of what arts and culture bring to the U.S. And I do, just to sort of piggyback on that previous question, I think technology has a really interesting role to play. As long as people don't try and make it a substitute for the experience, what has happened, I think, very productively is that a lot of artists have discovered, again, technology is a direct connection to audiences. And if organizations can't figure out how to expand that platform, to make it literally exponential, one of the things we've been developing at Bloomberg is a platform for cultural organizations that started out as a digital guide and has been incredibly successful because people want to carry around their favorite things in their pocket. I think you have to take the risk. You have to understand that if you didn't like the way things were going, try something different, switch it up. And that, I think, is what will ultimately circle back to the venture philanthropy crowd, because they pride themselves on being risk takers.
Jason, I want to ask you something talk about us as artists and the way artists are trained. Wouldn't it be great if artists could get SBA loans, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
But I don't think I don't know about Yale Drama School, NYU. I'm not so sure if there is, if business, the fact that we're in a business, I don't know how many collaborations there are between art schools and business schools in major universities. So I don't know if we're preparing our students to behave in a way that they would even know what to do in terms of getting an SBA loan.
I mean, I would suggest that, I as someone whose sort of principal engagement is with visual art and therefore with cultural production as a direct market value, I'm very interested.
They're more prepared.
Yeah. Well, you wish they were, and you'd be shocked to discover that people who go to the most prestigious MFAs in this country and who are then gobbled up in their mid-20s by some sort of young galleries or mid-sized or even large galleries, and then might not have much of a career 5 to 7 years after that, have been given relatively weak tools to understand the kind of everything from how to budget for a show to how to pay their taxes to how to have short-term, medium, and long-term planning. I am increasingly impressed by the how shall I say, by the willingness of younger artists to understand that you need different skills at different times and that different political orientations or different economic orientations are appropriate for different times, and away from a certain language of absolute purity or absolute certainty that I think was particularly in vogue maybe 100 years ago about the economic role of the artist, into something where you toggle between tabs. And I think that it's absolutely right, as Kate says, that philanthropists are sometimes looking for a return on investment. What I would suggest is that what you really, really want is sort of slow growth over time, as opposed to the sort of pump and dump model that some people might have in other sort of forms of the market. And so if you're a philanthropist who's really looking to see, I don't like using a term as vulgar as ROI on art, what you would really want is to provide people the skills and to provide people the wherewithal in order to build their careers in the long term. And does that mean giving them everything from, healthcare and other kinds of benefits to introducing them to different economic actors, different economic sectors in order to imagine different kinds of partnerships? There are 1,000 different ways in which we could imagine this. What I would say is, bravo to the kids out there who are a little more nimble and a little more mobile and a little less obsessed with staying in their one individual lane. That I think is really valuable.
Absolutely. So we have a very provocative question from Lori Tish. Okay, Lori, here's your provocative question. I'm just going to throw it out to everybody. And I think that'll wrap us up. Okay, Lori Tish, many fragile organizations will go under. I'm never quite sure when to offer emergency funding as opposed to letting nature take its course. Thoughts?
I think that's true at any moment. I think that's true for arts organizations across the board. That some will thrive and some will not thrive. Some will peter out and some will sustain, and some will sustain for much longer than they are actually impactful. One of the things that came up a lot during last year when we were really working to try to make sure we had enough runway so that we could come back was, people didn't want to go throw good money after bad organizations, institutions, foundations. They didn't want to do that. And I think one of the things that we had as an organization was this idea of like long-standing longevity, 85 years. And we were born in the middle of the first Great Depression, and so the fact that this idea that we would be able to respond with whatever resource to be able to secure ourselves, but I think it's also about emergency funding cannot ever just be emergency funding. It actually has to be foundational funding. It has when somebody comes to you and says, "I need this emergency money," the question really has to be about how is it supporting the foundation? How does this $5 support 5 years from now? As opposed to how do we just get through this time? And every time we made our case last year, we talked about beyond this, what is the future of our organization? I think for smaller organizations, it's a little bit different. But I think smaller organizations have the opportunity to evolve based on this idea of what emergency is. So something might falter, something is built at its place. Those same artists will go to a different opportunity and create something new if they're not able to sustain themselves during that time. So emergency funding still does the seeding, even if it's an offering to make sure that, again, the point of the organization is to sustain the artist, not the other way around. So thinking about emergency funding as a way to support and substantiate the life of the artist is probably going to get you a lot further than thinking about sustaining the organization itself.
Thank you. And they're telling me I have to shut down. So it just means to me, Erica Mallon, that we need to have think tank environments so that wonderful people like Jeremy and Kate and Jason and Nataki can, we have models for that at the Aspen Institute, not just public events, but we need to bring folks together. And I just want to thank Erica again and Kitty Boone. And back to something you mentioned, Kate, when I asked you to take a historical perspective, the Aspen Institute, although started with a great love of art, lost its way. And it wasn't until the wisdom and the philanthropy of the late Sidney Harmon, yes, Harmon, and Michael Eisner that it put art back into its enterprise. It lost that for a while. So I think the Aspen Institute itself is a way that we can look at how we reinvigorate spaces with the arts. I'll give you the last word, Erica.
Absolutely. The Institute is the place for these kind of panels. We can take this 30,000 foot view and support the new ideas, support artists and organizations, and keep the conversation going that leads to action. And this is a perfect example of, what's next, of people coming together, everyone's chatting amongst each other. And I certainly think there's part 2 and part 3, part 4 of this conversation. And I'm thrilled, and thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Anna, for your always fabulous moderating, and so much more to come. Thank you all.